The following data is derived from the United States Census Bureau from the 1860 census, compiled on the eve of the American Civil War. There are 31.4 million people in the United States in 1860, or about 11 people per square mile. This means that a few families lived within a given mile. Three regions of the country, the Northeast, the Midwest, and the South, show that the 31 million people in the United States were fairly evenly distributed between these three general areas. The Northeast contained 10.5 million people, the South contained 11 million people, and the Midwest contained 9 million residents in 1860. The upper Midwest was actually pretty settled by 1860, as it only took a few generations for large populations to emerge in these new states. In 1800, only 51,000 U.S. citizens resided in the Midwest. Of course, there were Native Americans living in the Great Lakes region that were not counted by the census, but in 60 years, those 51,000 Midwestern residents blossomed to 9 million by 1860. So there were essentially almost as many people living in the Great Lakes region as the Old Northeast or in the South. You can see the population advantage that the North has here. Two of these three main regions in the United States in 1860 are in the North. It is about a 2-to-1 advantage by population for the North over the South. About 9 in 10 Southerners and Midwesterners lived in a rural setting. However, in the Northeast, almost 4 in 10 people lived in a city setting, which is very high for the mid-19th century. In 1860, there are about 2 million farms in the United States. The Midwest has the most farms with 772,000. But the state with the most farms is actually New York State with 197,000 farms. The South, however, has the most acres of farmland. Virginia alone had 31 million acres of farmland, which in 1860 included West Virginia. Almost 4 million bales of cotton were produced in 1860, and some 40 million barrels of wheat flour were produced in that same year in the United States. There were 4.5 million African Americans in the United States in 1860, about 15% of the total population, or about 1 in 6 people. About 90% of African Americans in the United States were enslaved in 1860, and there are about 500,000 free African Americans. Several states had more than 1 million residents in 1860. Let's start with the South. The most populous state in the South was Virginia with 1.2 million residents. About 45% of Virginia was African American. Alabama is just shy of 1 million residents, but at 964,000 we will round it up to 1 million. Half of Alabama's population in 1860 was African American. Georgia was just over 1 million residents. Like Alabama, about half of Georgia's population was African American. North Carolina was at 993,000, and so again we'll round that up to 1 million. About 1/3 of North Carolina's residents were African American in 1860. Tennessee had 1.1 million residents in 1860, and about 25% of people in Tennessee were African American. So Tennessee's slave population was about half that of the states in the Deep South. Let's turn now to the North. Lincoln's Illinois had 1.7 million residents in 1860. Next door to Illinois, Indiana had a similar population at 1.4 million residents. Illinois and Indiana, two new states in 1860, had already surpassed Old Massachusetts in population by 1860. Massachusetts' population was at 1.2 million. However, Massachusetts was incredibly urban for 1860. 60% of Massachusetts residents were city dwellers. It was very high for anywhere in the world. A relatively new Midwestern state, Ohio, had twice the population of Massachusetts with 2.3 million residents. Ohio's growth, it was very fantastic, from 45,000 in 1800 to 2.3 million a few generations later in 1860. Let's turn to the Empire State. New York had emerged as the largest state population in the United States by far at 3.9 million. There were almost 4 million people in New York State in 1860. About 40% of New Yorkers were city dwellers, a very high rate for the middle 19th century. Another massive northern state is Pennsylvania with 2.9 million. About 1 in 3 Pennsylvanians were city dwellers in 1860. Let's look at some large border states. Kentucky had a population of 1.2 million. About 1 in 5 Kentuckians were African Americans in 1860. Another large border state was Missouri, also with 1.2 million. About 10% of Missouri was African American in 1860. An important demographic trend is that the proportion of the population that was African American and thus enslaved decreases in the Upper South. In the Deep South, about half the population was enslaved. In Tennessee, that number cuts in half to about 25% enslaved, and then one click above Tennessee and Kentucky, that number goes down again to 20% enslaved. An important note about South Carolina had 704,000 residents in 1860, and 412,000 were African American. This means that almost 6 in 10 residents of South Carolina were in bondage in 1860. We have talked about the eastern United States, but it's also true that 2 West Coast states existed in 1860. Let's shift the view westward. California and Oregon were states in 1860. California, interestingly, had 330,000 United States citizens. Oregon was also a state in 1860 with 52,000 intrepid pioneers there. Now, it's important to know that there were, of course, Native Americans living there that were not counted by the census. In 1860, the United States already stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We will reshift back toward the east. Let's look at cities now. The capital of the United States, Washington, had 75,000 residents in 1860. That might seem remarkable that the capital of the United States had only 75,000 residents, but what was once considered a big city in 1860 is different than what we would imagine today. Population density was much, much lower in the 19th century. A city larger than 40,000 in 1860 was a major cosmopolitan area. Boston, a city that was 240 years old in 1860, had a population of 178,000. Massachusetts had 41,000 shoemakers, 33,000 factory workers, and 14,000 mariners. Just below Boston is Providence, Rhode Island, population 51,000 in 1860. New York State has multiple large cities in 1860. New York City proper had a population of 806,000 residents, by far the largest city in the United States. New York City alone is larger than the entire population of Louisiana in 1860, despite the fact that Louisiana contained the largest city in the South, New Orleans. Brooklyn's population, tabulated distinctly from New York City, was 267,000. In upstate New York, Buffalo had a population of 81,000. a really huge city in 1860. Albany, New York had 62,400 residents. Rochester, another large city, had a population of 48,000. Troy, New York, had a population just under 40,000, making Troy a major city in 1860. New York had 39,000 carpenters, 19,000 male tailors, 14,000 female tailors, 18,000 blacksmiths, 18,600 teachers, 9,400 coopers, 5,600 printers, and 3,000 harness makers. Lest we make the mistake that all New Yorkers were city dwellers, there were 255,000 farmers in New York State in 1860 and an additional 116,000 farm laborers. New York State has both industry and agricultural power, a very diverse economy that was extremely formidable in its size and depth. New York State alone is a gigantic population and a diverse economy that will give the Union a huge advantage over the South. Philadelphia had a population of 565,000, which included 22,000 free African American residents. There were more people living in Philadelphia in 1860 than in the entire state of Arkansas. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania had 49,200 souls in 1860. Much smaller than Philadelphia and Pittsburgh was the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, which had 13,400 residents. Harrisburg is a good example of how different population sizes are from today. Harrisburg, the capital of a major industrial northern state, had an 1860 population that would amount to a small town today. Pennsylvania had 15,000 blacksmiths, 30,000 carpenters, 19,000 miners, and 4,000 iron workers in 1860. Ohio was well established as an industrial powerhouse by 1860. Cincinnati is one of the largest cities in the nation with 161,000 people. Cleveland's population was 43,400. Ohio had 10,000 blacksmiths, 2,700 wheelwrights, 2,500 machinists, and 2,200 steamboatmen. Illinois, like Ohio, emerged quickly from its pioneer days into an established economy. Chicago had a population of 109,000 in 1860. In 1860, Cincinnati, Ohio is still larger than Chicago, but Chicago is on its way to being one of the largest cities in the nation. Abraham Lincoln was one of 1,600 lawyers in Illinois in 1860, and the state also boasted 2,500 railroad workers and 3,000 wheelwrights. Above Illinois is Michigan. Detroit had a population of 45,600 in 1860. There were 3,500 miners and 1,600 coopers in Michigan. Across Lake Michigan is Wisconsin. Milwaukee, Wisconsin had a population of 45,000. About 1 in 3 Wisconsin men were foreign-born in 1860, with 124 Wisconsinians having been born in Germany and 50,000 born in Ireland. Wisconsin was home to 2,400 miners, 1,500 lumbermen, and 447 professional brewers in 1860. Baltimore, Maryland had a population of 212,400. Maryland's African American population was evenly distributed between slaves and freemen, with 84,000 free African American residents and 87,000 slaves in 1860. Kentucky contained a significant population center at Louisville, population 68,000. Kentucky was home to 4,000 seamstresses, 87 saddle makers, and 682 teamsters. St. Louis, Missouri had a population of 161,000 in 1860. Missouri had 4,300 blacksmiths, 1,400 steamboatmen, and 224 boat pilots. Now let's examine the southern population centers. Virginia was the most populous southern state in 1860, but it does not have a major metropolitan area to compete with a large Yankee center. The capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, had a population of 38,000. Petersburg, Virginia, had 18,000 residents. Norfolk had 14,600 residents, and Alexandria, Virginia, was home to 12,700. Virginia's workforce included 4,200 blacksmiths, 3,600 teachers, 1,300 oystermen, and 1,100 miners. The largest city in the South by far in 1860 was New Orleans, Louisiana, with 169,000 residents. New Orleans is the one city in the South that has the population size to match one of the mighty industrial centers of the North. Another large population center in the South in 1860 was Charleston, South Carolina, which had a population of 41,000 in 1860. You might be wondering, what about other southern cities like Atlanta or Nashville? Atlanta was a critical city of the South, but her population in 1860 was 9,500. 10,000 people was a big city in 1860, and most folks then would recognize Atlanta as a large population area. But by today's standards, it would be a very small town. But the blossoming industrial centers of the North were changing how large cities could become. Atlanta in 1860 was 11 times smaller than the relatively new city of Chicago, Illinois. Two critical cities in Tennessee also reflect the scale of 19th century demographics. Memphis, Tennessee had 23,000 residents, and Nashville had 17,000 residents. Let's now take a look at immigration and zoom out to the Atlantic. In 1860, over 4 million Americans were born in a foreign country. Of these 4 million immigrants, 1.6 million were born in Ireland. In 1860 alone, almost 50,000 immigrants arrived from Ireland, a population large enough to be one of the biggest cities in the United States. A major demographic change occurred following the potato famine. From 1847 through 1854, there were over 100,000 Irish immigrants each year to the United States. Germans accounted for almost as many foreign-born residents in 1860 as the Irish. 1.3 million Americans in 1860 were born in Germany. Like Ireland, Germany also had a major immigration wave in the 1850s, and between 1852 and 1854, each of those years had over 100,000 immigrants from Germany. In 1860 alone, there were 55,000 immigrants from Germany, again, a population large enough to be one of the biggest cities in the nation. Many of the first-generation immigrants worked in industrial centers, most of which were in the North. In 1860, America added 1,500 new miles of railroad to the train network, and the United States operated a total of 31,000 miles of railroad. American merchant shipping in 1860 consisted of almost 5.5 million tons of shipping, of which almost 1 million tons was steam shipping. Over 1,000 merchant vessels were built in 1860 alone in the United States. The lion's share of new ships were built in New England. However, almost 45,000 tons of shipping was built for the Great Lakes and Western River traffic. At the onset of the American Civil War, the 1860 census reveals tremendous population, economic, and industrial advantages for the North.